The heavy scent of cedar and mothballs hit Amanda the moment she shattered the window of her childhood home. At 72 years old, Amanda wasn't supposed to be breaking into houses, but the legal documents in her trembling hands said this property now belonged to a developer who intended to raze it by dawn. She swung her leg over the sill, her knees popping in the silence of the Maine woods. This was the house she had run away from 55 years ago, leaving her mother and father with nothing but a cold note on the kitchen table. She had spent a lifetime building a corporate empire in Chicago, becoming a grandmother to children who barely knew her name, all while pretending her own parents never existed. But 3 days ago, a rusted safe deposit box key arrived in the mail with a death certificate dated 20 years prior. Her mother had lived in this house until the end, waiting for a daughter who never called. Amanda's flashlight swept over the living room. It was frozen in time. The plastic covers were still on the floral sofa. The rotary phone sat on the side table as if waiting for a ring that never came. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic reminder of the guilt she had buried under decades of expensive suits and high-rise apartments. She wasn't here for nostalgia. She was here because the letter accompanying the key mentioned a debt of blood hidden beneath the floorboards. As she reached the center of the room, the floor groaned. She knelt, her designer slacks staining with ancient dust, and began to pry at the loose wood. Her fingernails tore, but she didn't feel the pain. She was possessed by a need to see what her parents had kept for her. Just as the board gave way, revealing a dark cavity stuffed with yellowing envelopes, a heavy thud echoed from the floor above. Amanda froze. The house was supposed to be empty. The developer's guards weren't scheduled until 6 in the morning. She held her breath, the flashlight beam dancing wildly against the wall. Then came the sound, a slow, rhythmic dragging noise, like a heavy trunk being pulled across the rafters directly over her head. A voice, thin and reedy, whispered her name through the vents. "Amanda, you finally came home to pay." The flashlight slipped from her hand and rolled across the floor, the beam landing on a pair of mud-caked boots standing just inches away from her in the dark. Amanda scrambled backward, her heels skidding on the hardwood. The figure in the shadows didn't move. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light reflecting off the dust motes, she realized the boots were empty. They were her father's old work boots, placed neatly by the armchair, but they were covered in fresh, wet mud. The dragging sound upstairs stopped abruptly. "Who's there?" Amanda managed to gasp, her voice cracking. There was no answer, only the low moan of the wind through the broken window. She grabbed her flashlight and the bundle of envelopes from the floor, her mind racing. She was a grandmother now. She had survived boardrooms and bankruptcy, yet in this house, she felt like the scared 17-year-old girl who had stolen her mother's jewelry to buy a bus ticket to the city. She tore open the first envelope. It wasn't a letter. It was a ledger. Page after page was filled with her father's cramped handwriting, documenting every cent they had saved since the day she left. They hadn't been poor because of bad luck. They had been poor because they were pouring every dime into a trust fund for a daughter who had abandoned them. But as she flipped to the later years, the entries turned dark. June 1994. The debt is growing. They came again. They want what Amanda took. Amanda's brow furrowed. She hadn't taken anything but a few gold rings. Or had she? A memory surfaced, a heavy, iron cylinder she'd found in the attic as a teen and sold to a pawn shop for $1,000. She had thought it was scrap metal. The dragging sound started again, louder this time, descending the stairs. Thud. Scrape. Thud. Amanda bolted toward the kitchen, intent on escaping through the back door, but she stopped dead. The kitchen table was set for three. 3 plates of rotting, desiccated food. 3 glasses filled with black, stagnant water. And in the center of the table sat the iron cylinder she had sold 55 years ago. It was polished, gleaming, and humming with a low, vibrating frequency that made her teeth ache. Beside it lay a fresh note in her mother's elegant script. "The treasure of the elder is not gold, Amanda. It is the time you stole from us. Now, the time must be repaid." She turned to run, but the kitchen door slammed shut and locked itself from the outside, and the handle began to glow a dull, fiery red. The heat from the door handle radiated through the kitchen, smelling of scorched wood and sulfur. Amanda backed away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She was trapped in the very room where she had last seen her mother's face, a face tear-streaked and pleading as Amanda had walked out the door. The humming from the iron cylinder grew louder, a physical weight pressing against her chest. "I'm sorry," she screamed into the empty house. "I was young. I didn't know." The dragging sound was now right outside the kitchen door. The wood began to groan as if something immensely heavy was leaning against it, trying to force its way through the frame. She looked at the ledger again, desperately searching for an explanation. The final pages weren't written by her father. The handwriting was jagged, alien. The pact was broken when the vessel was sold. The elder demands the years returned. A life for a life. A grandmother's legacy for a daughter's sin. Amanda realized with a jolt of horror that her parents hadn't just been saving money, they had been bartering with something ancient to keep the elder away from her. They had stayed in this decaying house, suffering in silence, to act as a shield. Now that they were dead, the shield was gone. The treasure wasn't the cylinder was a cage for a debt that never died. The door hinges screamed as they began to buckle. A pale, translucent mist started to seep through the cracks, smelling of the deep forest and ancient earth. Amanda realized that if she didn't find a way to settle this debt, she wouldn't just lose her life. The shadow following her would find its way to her own grandchildren back in the city. She looked at the cylinder. It had a small keyhole at the base, the exact shape of the safe deposit key she had received in the mail. With trembling fingers, she reached into her pocket. The metal of the cylinder burned her skin as she touched it, but she forced the key into the slot. As she turned the key, the back of the house was suddenly ripped away by a massive, unseen force, revealing the dark woods outside and a line of hooded figures standing silently among the trees, waiting for her. The hooded figures didn't move, their faces lost in the absolute vacuum of their cowls. The mist from the kitchen flowed toward them like a living tide. Amanda stood on the edge of the jagged floorboards where the wall had been, clutching the iron cylinder to her chest. The humming had stopped, replaced by a rhythmic chanting that seemed to vibrate from the very ground. "What do you want?" she cried out, her voice lost in the roaring wind. One of the figures stepped forward, dropping its hood. Amanda gasped, the cylinder nearly falling from her hands. It was herself, or rather, a version of herself as she was at 17, vibrant and cruel, wearing the same dress she had worn the night she ran away. "The treasure of the elder is the continuity of the soul," the young Amanda said, her voice echoing with 1,000 overlapping tones. "You broke the chain. You left the elders to rot, and in doing so, you severed your own future. You are a grandmother now, but you have no roots. Your grandchildren are hollow because you gave them no history." The apparition pointed a finger at the iron cylinder. "The years your parents gave to protect you are inside that vessel. You can use them to buy your way out of this forest, or you can give them back to the lineage you abandoned. But you cannot do both." Amanda looked back at the house, the site of her greatest shame. She saw the ghosts of her parents sitting at the table, their expressions not of anger, but of a profound, soul-crushing weariness. They had spent 50 years in a purgatory of her making. If she opened the cylinder and released the years, she would be restored, her youth returned, and her guilt erased. She would be the woman she always pretended to be. But her parents would vanish into nothingness, their sacrifice forgotten, and her own grandchildren would grow up as cold and detached as she had been. The figures in the woods began to close in, their footsteps silent on the dead leaves. "Choose, Grandma," the younger version of herself hissed, her face beginning to distort into something monstrous and clawed. "Give us the vessel, or become part of the woods forever." The air grew cold enough to crack the remaining windows of the house. Amanda looked at the treasure in her hands, the stolen years of her parents' lives, the physical manifestation of their sacrifice. She looked at the monstrous version of her younger self, the personification of her own selfishness. For 70 years, Amanda had lived for Amanda. She had built a kingdom of glass and steel, thinking she had outrun her past. But standing here, in the ruins of the home she had betrayed, She finally understood the treasure of the Elder. It wasn't about holding on to life. It was about passing the light forward, even if it meant sitting in the dark yourself. I don't want the years, Amanda whispered, her voice gaining a sudden, ironclad strength. They aren't mine to take. Instead of handing the cylinder to the shadow or using it for herself, she turned back to the ghosts of her parents at the table. She walked through the freezing mist and placed the iron vessel in the center of their rotting plates. This belongs to the house. It belongs to the memory of those who stayed. She knelt before the spectral images of her mother and father, bowing her head. I am sorry. I was a child who didn't understand that a family is a circle, not a ladder. The moment her forehead touched the dusty floor, the world exploded in white light. The hooded figures shrieked and dissolved into ash. The iron cylinder shattered, releasing a warm, golden glow that filled the room, mending the broken walls and cleaning the stained floors in a blur of impossible motion. When Amanda opened her eyes, the sun was rising over the Maine pines. The house was silent, but it no longer felt cold. It felt peaceful. She was still 72, her joints still ached, and the developer's bulldozers were likely miles away, but the heavy weight of 55 years of guilt was gone. She walked out the front door, leaving the ledger and the empty boots behind. She had a long drive ahead of her back to Chicago, but she knew what she had to do. She would gather her grandchildren and tell them the true story of their great-grandparents. She would teach them that the greatest treasure an elder can leave is not money or property, but the story of where they came from and the sacrifices made to get them there. Amanda looked back one last time at the house. She could never truly go back to the girl she was, but for the first time in her life, she was finally home. The end.